Greetings, everybody. Now, I have the glorious role of being both the MC and the presenter for this session, and I'm going to be talking to you about the evolution of consciousness. I want to tell you a little bit about myself first, so that you know the context for my approach. Now, if you want to find out more about me, here are some 3 different links that will have different kinds of profiles on me according to how various institutions see me. Essentially, I'm a historian trained, an educator by life experience and practice. I did my PhD in futures education, which also means I'm a futurist. So I'm looking forward, looking back, looking around simultaneously, and it gives me and I'm very lucky actually to be able to teach world history, which I think has given me a lot of the kind of structure for how I've approached this question of the evolution of consciousness. It's a huge topic, and to try and cover it in 20 to 30 minutes is going to test me, but I think it will also test you in the audience. So there are 3 things I'd like to do in this talk. First of all, I'd like to situate Neohumanism within an evolutionary narrative so that we can see how it's starting to make sense, or why it's coming up now, why we didn't have it 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. Why are we exploring this period that we would hope, and its preferred future, that would be marked by a neo-humanistic consciousness? So how does that fit in? And then I want to also look at how to sort of make sense of it through description of evolutionary consciousness as various forms of organizing around relationship. How do we understand our relationship with the world we inhabit? Then to move on to the kind of future element that we've got here. So I want to suggest that the future, and it's one possible one, of course, there could be many futures, and it's my preferred future, is to see evolution take the next step towards greater consciousness or greater awareness of relationship. So the background to all of this, it's been very important for me as an historian, an educator, and a futurist to make sense of, to have a sense of how the current struggles towards more wholesome, love-filled world fit into this human story of ours. So that's, I think, a key question that's always motivated my interest in the historical, but also in the future. So it's key, I think, to understand our story as a movement or an evolution from simple to complex. And also, we can understand it as moving from inanimate life, or matter, to life, and from life to self-consciousness, and then on to what I'm calling or thinking of as a relational consciousness. So I want to give you a working definition of consciousness. Consciousness, for me, is an organizing principle. It's a non-local state, and it's expressed, though, in local forms or local phenomena. The non-local in Tantra is nirguna, the nirguna state, whereas the local is saguna, where forms manifest, but they are all structured around local pressures and local drivers that define and construct the meaning or the expression at that time. So according to time, place, person, consciousness fluctuates, but it has an energy we can call order if we're dealing with inanimate matter, or awareness if we're dealing with living matter. In the human context, we might call this energy individual awareness, and at the collective level, we would call it culture. For me, I like to think of consciousness as conversation, really. When we became self-conscious, or as we became self-conscious, we became aware that we inhabited a non-local, a cosmic context. And all forms have been in that conversation. Even inanimate matter is in a kind of relational dialectic between its microcosmic form and that macrocosm. So consciousness is the conversation each element of this universe has with the whole. Ultimately, this conversation, therefore, for me, is an expression of love, because relationship is about love. If we look at some very interesting scientists, Lynn Margulis and her son Dion Sagan, they wrote a book called The Meaning of Life. Or no, What is Life? That's right, not The Meaning of Life. That's more like Monty Python, really. No, this is What is Life? And they said life is not merely matter, but matter energized, matter organized, matter with a glorious and built-in history. So that, for me, is the general proposition from which I'm working. Sarkar argues that everything is consciousness. It is the self-organizing principle of the cosmos. Neohumanism can be understood as the philosophical commitment to living as though everything is conscious, or consciousness. In inanimate matter, consciousness is stored in molecular patterns like crystals and so on, and bounded by either the laws, or you could actually say, the laws of the Newtonian or quantum physics. Living things are subject to these laws, but in living things, consciousness is expressed through problem solving around how to extract energy from the environment. Living things need energy. All living things are constantly in a quest for energy. So these solutions originally were stored in our DNA. So DNA was a kind of organic memory. But there is also cultural memory or collective memory. Culture is what we do. Culture is essentially how we define and understand ourselves. Human beings are culture makers. We make pattern, we tell stories, we narrate, we live story. Culture keeps us safe, both physically, but also existentially. In other words, culture is what we fall back to or default onto in times of stress. So when lots of change, we tend to want to become more conservative. This is, of course, the source of fundamentalisms of all kinds. So when we're stressed, we fall back on the basic pattern. But that stress we also experience psychologically or existentially. And again, we fall back onto patterns that we know, that are familiar, that were kind of encoded into us from the moment we were conceived. But there's another aspect to culture, and this is that it's also a set of conditions around which, or within which, we are able to fulfill our potential, human potential. So there is a conservative aspect to culture, but there's also a radical, transformative aspect to culture. The major changes that have happened and defined human progress have all been culture reimagining itself, transforming itself. It's the exciting part of culture. So this is my map, and I'll return to this map over and over again. I'm going to walk you through basically a history lesson on how I understand consciousness moving across the human story, or through the human story. From the cosmic, you can see there's a layer of cosmic, there's the indigenous, there's the agricultural, there's the industrial, and there is the relational. And if you look at the bottom axis, the y-axis, we've got collective 1, collective 2, civilization 1, individual 1, civilization 2, individual 2, civilization 3. And I'm going to walk us through those things. And one at a time, trying not to rush too fast, but obviously glossing. So here we go. So in the beginning of human history, we were few and roamed the earth, well, parts of East Africa at least, in very small family bands. If we study our DNA, we know that there is actually a mitochondrial Eve, from whom all human beings, unless there's some surprises somewhere, seem to have descended. She lived around 180,000 years ago, and at that time, geneticists and paleontologists estimate there were about 20,000 people, individuals living in East Africa in small bands. So that's in the beginning. Education at this time, and for thousands of years, was transmitted orally and through example. It was what happened naturally as you were encultured into your family band. Spirituality was in the air. So this is collective 1. This is the period of the Indigenous, where life was collective and the cosmos was a source of wonder and meaning. Then there were some environmental changes. These affected food supply, and some innovative people in Southwest Asia developed agriculture. This was about 11,000 years ago. So we've gone from mitochondrial Eve 180,000 years ago. Now we're suddenly 11,000 years ago. So you can see this huge amount of time. This is the dreaming. Now, this period is still with us. It's not gone, but it's submerged within more recent patterns of consciousness. So education still at this time was transmitted orally and through example. Spirituality was mostly in the air, but it was also starting to be found in temples or sacred places, groves of trees, around rocks, sacred sites. People began to specialize also at this time. People began to build permanent homes. So this was the period that we could call the beginning of the agricultural revolution. And we had revolutions within revolutions from about 11,000 years ago, according to the archaeologists and such. It were the people called the Natufians around 11,000 years ago that started practicing agriculture. And because it amplified our ability to access energy, we bred, we populated, and very quickly in places where agriculture emerged, it became the dominant social form. It was a dominant consciousness. This is the period of collective too. So this period was much like that of before, but it was beginning to move away from the embedded relational consciousness that defines collective one. So here's the little image that I showed you again. There's collective two, and this is the beginning of civilization one. Okay, we had cities, for instance. So cities, over the generations, populations in these small villages grew into towns, and towns became cities. Most education remained oral at this time, okay, but small schools began to emerge to cater for specialized needs, such as writing and arithmetic. Cities needed order and organizing. Commerce, of course, was at the center of cities, and really the very first numeracy and literacies appear around not the sacred, but the secular or the profane, you could say. It's the writing, so you could keep tallies on what you're exchanging. We didn't sell things then, we bartered or trade. There was no money for many thousands of years. Spirituality began to be organized as a result also, and associated with places and authority. Periods of increased specialization as cities needed specialists. No longer could you be a jack of all trades. Populations continued, of course, to grow because we were increasing our ability to access energy from the environment. And nature began to be seen as a resource. We began to look at nature as something outside of ourselves and our organizations. Here's a classic ancient city in which you can see hierarchy represented in the architecture, in the form of that space. So this is the period of civilization and collective too. This period saw an increase in separation from culture and nature. Between them, they separated. Okay, there was an increased sense of the individual. It was still largely latent, but it was growing. This is the beginning of early civilizations and human intensification. And that means that the human footprint was felt heavier in certain places. Of course, empires amplified this. So all this continued and cities became powerful and were led by strong rulers. Hierarchy, as I pointed out, was important, and power led to conflicts and empires. Education became a tool for managing these complex social order. There were priest kings, and they mostly controlled all of this through the elites, okay, the elites also became literate, but the elites were separated between warrior elites who largely disdained reading and writing, but there were intellectual elites, priesthoods and scribes and so on. The bureaucrats were out there even then. Specialization and militarization increased, of course, because empires found that they needed to have strong military arms to maintain themselves, extend themselves, and protect themselves. So here we have the wonderful Chinese warriors, and we also have the other side, the elite side of high culture. The beauty, let's say, of this Chinese silk painting captures that for me. So collective two, back to our little drawing again, you can see here we are, the agricultural civilizations, and they lasted up until the end of the Renaissance in Europe, and of course beyond that in Asia and Africa and the Americas. The distance between culture and nature increased over this time. Hierarchies continue to grow, and a small but powerful group of people, and this is really important, begin to think of themselves as individuals first and members of collectives second. Okay, civilizations flourish. There's a sense of relationship begins to diminish again. So the relationship now is not even just relationship with tribe, but or people, that what we call geosentiment. It becomes more socio-sentimental in that we relate to smaller groups within larger sections of a community. At this time, about 500 years ago, we have humanism emerging as a phenomenon within the European culture. Okay, it was called humanism because it focused on the human as a species with a mission, you could say, a sense of specialness, chosenness, that we were chosen in some way and we stood above and beyond other things. Human emphasized a new approach to being human, and it also emphasized a new approach to learning based on literacy and, in brackets, European culture. It was definitely, and is still definitely, a European product. It's been exported everywhere. So European education became a vehicle for spreading humanism. Okay, and this is what European cultures did. They went to other places and imposed their cultural template, their learning on societies that had their own wonderful literature, their own wonderful traditions. I think the Maya are a great example of that. The fact that and the Inca too, that the Central American and South American cultures had their literature destroyed by the Spanish because it was seen as somehow unchristian. It made them feel extremely uncomfortable. That is, the imperialists. So this is the downside of humanism. Of course, there's much wonder and magic that we can associate with humanism as an experiment in consciousness. As more people became literate, it was hard, however, for the church, who had a monopoly on all things right in Europe, to hold them together. Individualism grew. We have people like Erasmus here. That's Erasmus with the fur cap, and one of my heroes, Sebastian Castellio, who was a humanist with spunk, because he really challenged the authority of everything, including literacy itself. He said the first thing that an intellectual or a scholar needs to do, or anybody really who's going to be a decent citizen, they need to doubt. So he wrote a wonderful book called The Art of Doubting. It got him into a lot of trouble, I can tell you. So this is a period that's leading up to a great transition, another transition, just as significant as the transition from hunter-gatherer to agriculture. We're now moving out of that period of the agricultural civilization, or civilization one. Humanism continued to the separation between culture and nature. Authority became increasingly personal or inner. This is what Martin Luther was all about. Reasoning became more important. Rationality, to be rational, became a hallmark of the great humanists. But humanists moved from being Christian humanists into secular humanists. And there's a lot of pain and suffering around that, because it was a way that humanists sought to escape the horrors of the religious wars that scarred Europe for many centuries. Scientific method also emerged as a result of this humanism. This was a period of devastating intolerance, massive violence, and there was struggles to overcome it as well. Hence secular humanism, for instance, and scientific method, and our rationality before everything else, the stuff that Voltaire, for instance, epitomizes. Individualism slowly grew more widespread throughout this period. Individual authority resides within. A new kind of civilization begins to emerge. And of course this means a new kind of consciousness begins to emerge, and it's based on scientific knowledge. This leads into the Industrial Revolution, which is another way of organizing our relationship with energy. Around 250 years ago, science and commerce merge. They're no longer separate things, and it's directed towards a powerful new civilizational model. Individuals become more important and more self-obsessed. The novel is a fantastic example of self-obsessed cultural expression. Education is used as a tool to develop a literate and obedient workforce. Education is modeled on the factory. Specialization within education and the factory is the norm. Capitalism emerges and promotes dynamic and rapid cultural change. Capitalism is a form of consciousness. And this is what it results in. About 150 years ago, this is the beginning of a period of devastating reordering of social space, of purpose, a reconfiguring of our relationship with, you could say, nature, or at least with the environment is probably a better way of putting it. Okay, and it's all about me. So we're now moving into individualism 1. This is a period of hyper-individualism that characterized, I think, in particularly the 20th century. Once people became affluent enough, we were all able to focus on ourselves in ways that we'd never had the luxury of doing before. This is a new civilizational model is emerging here. This is the period of the West, in the West, of increasingly strong individualism. This individualism ushers in a form of capitalism that makes some people very wealthy and increases the general prosperity of about a quarter of all people on the planet. Over time, more and more people are drawn into this dynamic, so that China now, we can see, of course, is catching up. 500 million people have been dragged out of poverty in the last 25 years. It's an extraordinary achievement. It comes, of course, at a cost as people increasingly lose contact with nature deficit syndrome we could call it, and with one another. So we become dislocated, isolated in our own psyches. And this and hyper competition arises. So we have what sociologists call anomie, that separation. Loneliness and meaningless increase as a result. So at this point, if we look now, we can see, if you follow that dotted line, that inverted bell curve here, this is showing our sense of relationship. High up on the y-axis, we have, or is it the x-axis? I always get mixed up. X. That's right. Is high levels of relational consciousness. We come and we lose sense of relationship as we move through agriculture from the indigenous into agriculture into the industrial. Now we're at a point where we're being forced to recognise the inadequacies, the weaknesses, the unsustainability of this process. So we're faced with new and surprising problems. Humanity looks for new forms to live by, just as people have done in the past when things don't work. There are two tendencies. We can fall back into culture one and become fundamentalist, whether that's capitalist fundamentalist or whether it's some form of religious fundamentalist or tribal fundamentalist and the Taliban sort of forms. Or we can look forward to transformative practice. And human consciousness will obviously bifurcate and struggle over these two forms. This is a search, in my opinion, for relational consciousness. So, a relational civilization, a new form of consciousness in the making. I think all of us here in this webinar are sharing an aspiration for this kind of thing. The unsustainability of the industrial and capitalist system has become increasingly clear. So we're beginning to relearn what the Indigenous already knew, that all things are connected. Education for individualism, which is the dominant form of education we have in our schools today, is losing its authority. Okay, and that's why so much energy and focus is being put by, I would call it conservative culture, on trying to hyper-intensify education. Okay, but you know the other side of it is that with Neohumanist education and all the other forms of education for resistance, we're finding a soft individualism is emerging. Education shifts to develop a relational neo-humanist consciousness. This is what Ananda schools are seeking to foster. Technology and nature, we stand at a possibility where they can develop a new partnerships, that will define a new period. This is a period of return to natural forms, but we're not going to necessarily lose what we have today. This is not going backwards to a energy regime that's not going to be able to support the 7 odd billion or 9 if we forecast into the future billion people on the planet. But technology and people and nature are going to have to work out new patterns for existing. So we're heading towards this new individualism. I'm calling it individualism 2, soft individualism, relational individualism. This is a period of nested soft individualism where people find themselves in relation to the whole. Remember, I think of consciousness as a conversation. So it's a conversation with that which is outside of me, but actually makes me me. I don't exist without the cosmos. I don't exist without my fellow human beings. All the relationships that I am embedded in, as I view them, actually reinforce me. It reinforces my consciousness. Loneliness and meaninglessness in this sort of world can decline. I would say optimism increases. Partnerships between men, women, nature and culture emerge. Spirituality is separated from hierarchical religion. It was a false marriage from the beginning and becomes a social force and the ethical benchmark for healthy and inclusive relationships. So here it is. Here's the story. If you follow those dotted lines as we go down, down, down into a hyper-individualism, and then we're on just starting this upward movement into a new civilizational form. And it's this civilizational form that actually makes sense of our longing for a Neohumanist relational order, or way of organizing ourselves, a pattern you could call it, for consciousness and an emergent culture. So in this talk I've tried to situate neo-humanism with an evolutionary narrative. That's this story I've just whizzed through at supersonic speed. I've sought to describe the evolution of consciousness as various forms of organization, of relationship, different forms of different periods of human history. We can see these relationships expressed in different ways. I'm seeking to suggest that the future, and it's one possible, my preferred future, is to see evolution take the next step towards greater consciousness of relationship. This is what Gurukul is working towards. And it's here that I finish my talk, and now we're looking at the clock. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes available for questions, discussion. There's ways that we can do this. People can raise their hands, and I'm just skimming up and down, and also you can ask questions. I'm just looking here to see no questions have come up, so I'll close that question section then, and I will look at the attendee list. There are 14 people there now, and welcome to those who arrived late in the talk. It's really great to have you here. I'm interested in some questions. Now, I know that I might start off because I know Henk and I have been having an email discussion here about consciousness and various things. So I'm opening up to hear from Henk. Any thoughts on my presentation, Henk? Any questions, any observations you'd like to make?
Not so easy. You have presented many fundamental things and many cultural and intellectual ideas. Mm-hmm. One thing which I find important is something you mentioned, that you consider local consciousness and non-local consciousness. Yep. And local consciousness you consider to be Saguna Brahma, and non-local as Nirguna Brahma. Mm. So I think scientifically speaking, in general, most scientists would not agree or would not know what you are thinking about.
That's true.
And they consider local consciousness to be, you can say, more or less individual forms of consciousness, and non-local as universal consciousness.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Yeah, the universal consciousness is, I would see it as sort of the white noise, the noise behind the consciousness that that, let's say, you and I experience on a day-to-day basis, but also the consciousness that a rock would experience as it warms in the sun's rays, or that a star experiences as it chews up hydrogen and lives its life out over billions of years. But I guess for me the point is, and Nirguna Brahma, of course, is a very abstract term, and it is the you could say from a tantric philosophical perspective, the white noise behind the white noise. It is the white canvas on which the painting is happened, and then there's the molecules of the paint, or something like that. I don't know whether that's actually a really good analogy. I prefer to think of, as I said, consciousness as ordering principles or organizing principles. What do you think of that as a way of approaching the question of consciousness?
Yes, so I would say that consciousness and energy are both together are the organizing principle.
Yeah, yeah. I've got sorry, go on.
And I also think that there's a big difference between awareness and consciousness. In general, consciousness is painted as something very undressed. It's only awareness.
Yes.
There's hardly any difference between awareness and consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think consciousness is much more essential. It has all the qualities of knowledge, of intellect, of creativity, of joy, of happiness.
Yep.
If consciousness is the material cause of the universe, it must be a substance, like for instance, just as a metaphor, a stone, a brick stone. A brick
Yep.
stone has special qualities, and consciousness has special qualities, has special characteristics. And this is, at the moment, it's totally not understood and not accepted to exist even.
Yeah, no, I would agree.
What do you think about that?
I would say that your understanding of consciousness obviously puts it in a way that means that we can actually approach the question of how elements of this overall universe make sense within a consciousness pattern. And there's a whole, and we should have a whole webinar just around that one question. Henk, I can see that Gil, Douglas, and also Shambhavananda have indicated they would like to contribute something. So I'm going to flick over to Gil first and then to Dada. Gil, how are you?
So can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Can you hear me, Marcus?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Yeah. Oh, good. Like Hank, I think I'm, I suppose, wrestling with, I guess, the understanding or definition of consciousness that we're talking about.
Yep.
And so when you mentioned, for instance, the idea of a rock warming in the sun or the sun burning up its energy,
yep.
I mean, I'm sort of thinking about sentience,
yep.
and the awareness, the self-awareness
yep.
that for me constitutes my understanding of consciousness, whereas the rock and the sun, I would put forward, doesn't necessarily have that same awareness.
That's right, and I would agree. The consciousness is as I approach it, consciousness is an organizing principle. For us in our hyper-individualistic age, we've very much located consciousness within the head, within a certain kind of discourse of awareness, of sentience, as you put it. For me, there are different versions or modalities through which consciousness moves from, but we're approaching consciousness in a sense, in a very classical early Greek approach, or a classical Indian epistemological approach, which takes it out of the Enlightenment era, the Humanist era, which of course have deeply shaped how our society and our civilization generally approach this question of consciousness. So for me, I'm, as you can see from this talk, in a sense, I'm actually arguing for I guess a a redefinition of how we approach consciousness. This is, I think, where Henk is going with his desire to actually say, okay, so if consciousness is not just something that is about being aware that I'm me, I think, therefore I am kind of formula that Descartes gave us. If it's something beyond that, then what are the qualities of it? And I'm not seeking to define all those qualities, but certainly I would suggest that there is a different way of profiling those qualities.
Sure.
Yeah,
okay.
I might jump.
All right, I'm all ears.
Okay, I'll jump across to Dada Shambhashivananda, who I just unmute you, Dada. There. Yeah. What are your thoughts on all of this, Dada?
Well, the whole idea of consciousness and the evolution of consciousness. When we talk about evolution of consciousness, has not been the same since the beginning. Or maybe its manifestation has changed over a period of time. There are two ways to look at the idea of consciousness. One is the primordial consciousness. You know, everything is consciousness. We call supreme consciousness and the consciousness, universal consciousness.
You're breaking up, Dada. Yeah, you're recording. Your speed must be quite slow.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't think
what I was saying
people
is
got that.
Can you hear me?
Not very well.
The consciousness. When we talk about evolution of consciousness, that means it means that it's undergoing change or some different degrees of manifest consciousness. So what I was saying was that the whole idea of consciousness, two witnesses. One is that it is something, that primordial energy, that primordial force, that cognition pitch out of which everything comes.
Yep.
That's the idea of the spirituality as born from the Tantra tradition, that everything is consciousness. But in day-to-day life, we also see different manifestations of consciousness, which you call converts, not being the same. And even in the individual cultural life of instinct or sense, higher awareness, you know, we see there's a lot of diversity in this creation in the form. So we know that there is some evolution of consciousness.
Yeah, I'll stop you there, Dada. I think we can.
That's just a philosophical kind of.
Yeah, I think I'll stop you there because you're breaking up a lot, and I think it. But I think we all can get that point that there's I wouldn't say it as a tension, but there are different layers or ways of understanding consciousness, and that as it's experienced at the local, and that could be the not just at the human local, it's experienced in the life forms of plants and animals. It's experienced also in the organizing principles that, let's say, inform chemical reactions and so on, that these patterns all take very specific forms. Within the conversation that we're having, though, I'm actually trying to understand, well, there's much happening on our planet that we are all anxious and worried about, and that we're seeking to challenge. And the seeking to challenge is happening in two ways. One, people are pulling back into greater conservatism. We see this politically. We see it in many ways being expressed in various forms of violence. But there are also what people would call cultural creatives working towards a new form of relating to the world that we live in. We in Gurukul call that Neohumanism, and it can be given many different names according to where we are. So it's not like that any group has a monopoly on this, but that this consciousness, and you could be a secular atheist, materialist, classic materialist, and still say we live within systems, and that these systems inform how we're going to respond over time and work towards greater levels of sustainability. Now, those systems are all based on awareness of relationship. So somehow there's this, at the very bottom line there is this sense that we're working towards some greater or expansion of our ability to relate consciously as human beings to the rest of this cosmos, on which we're having, in our planetary context, an ever-increasing impact. So to address that is the challenge of our time, I would say, and what makes sense of this neo-humanist work, that journey that we're on. It makes sense to me of the work that Gurukul is committed to, of weaving together in new ways the disciplines that have been separated. There are new disciplines emerging as, and it's not obviously anything that anybody's got a monopoly on. There's a collective consciousness working on our planet at the moment towards new forms that hopefully will increase resilience, increase sustainability over the next few centuries as we move beyond an industrial conservative model to some new way of thinking about things. Yeah, I'm just looking to see if anybody else. Marta's put a hand up. I'll go to Marta and then to Hank, and that'll probably almost be our time up. So hang on, Marta. Marta, how are you?
Okay.
Are you there? Hi there.
All right.
Yeah.
Hi. Look, I was just looking at this lovely picture you had of the seashell or sparrow, and that made me wonder, going away from the really controversial concept of consciousness, going towards more the evolutionary side of your lecture. Is there any overlap with the spiral dynamics theory and the neo-humanist way of looking at evolution as such?
Yeah. Spiral dynamics is really interesting, and I think it's a very sophisticated attempt to, in a sense, chart this journey. The various layers of consciousness or ways of organizing. That's really what spiral dynamics is on about, ways of organizing ourselves. So when we meet a problem, where you are in the spiral will determine how you respond. And I've always felt a deep resonance between the two things, two forms or the two approaches. As always, the cultural origins of works to some extent determine the ways in which they are perhaps enacted. So spiral dynamics comes out of a stronger Western Platonic and Neoplatonic sort of pattern than Neohumanism, which is more deeply informed with Eastern thinking, particularly that of Tantra. But I would say, Marta, you picked up on a really important point, that there are very strong similarities here, and that we are all working in our own creative spaces, our own cultural spaces, with the tools we have culturally available to us to deal with this question of this evolution and where the heck are we going? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No problems. I'll return to Hank. Hank, you've got voice again.
I would like to say one thing is what he learned from the past. Something of that learning is still important at the moment, and something of that is important for the future. But what education, what neo-humanist education, what culture in general, what science in general, what all fields of thought need is a new and subtle way of thinking. A new and subtle way to understand consciousness, to understand awareness, to understand the relation between consciousness and energy, between consciousness, your awareness and my awareness, between social awareness and individual awareness. And that is, I think, is a very important aspect that we need now. We cannot use subtler methods to cure disease if we have not learned more subtle parts of science. And we cannot develop new parts of science if we are not, say, subtlifying science itself and our approach and our unbiased approach.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, thank you, Hank. That's a really important point. I've noticed that Didi Anandaritama has got something. I might quickly switch to see and let her hear from her. Didi, how are you?
Yes, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm great.
I have a different kind of... Can you hear?
Yes, we can. Whoop. You've got a slight connection problem, but go on.
Okay. I have a slightly different kind of question or comment. I'm very interested in mother-infant relationships, and lots of researchers have said that we took a evolutionarily great leap in consciousness when mothers began to care for their young for prolonged periods of time.
Yeah.
And that, of course, humans do that even more than other mammals, and that allowed for offspring to have a greater intelligence, evolution of intelligence, and then, of course, as social structures and organizations flourished, then this bond between the mother and the child is very basic, and it's a very basic, the most primal bond between humans.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in this concept of this bond as a human love, how that is significant in the evolution of consciousness. Do you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're talking about an absolutely fundamental thing, because consciousness is deeply intimate, and the intimacy of the mother-child bond, of course, is where it all starts. Because consciousness, from a human perspective, it's all about us, and it's about our ability to relate beyond us and look at another person's eyes, for instance, or look at a tree or whatever. So this, again, it's about relationship, and that mother-child bond, as you say, it began at least probably 200,000 years ago. And it grew and became more subtle over time. It certainly has, how we approach it, that's what I should say. How do we approach that? Well, the way we approach it is going to actually underpin so much of this next 2 or 3, 4 generations as we struggle with this question of developing a subtler consciousness, the kind of consciousness that Hank was flagging. I will skip on if you don't mind, Didi. It's a great point, because I've noticed that there are still other hands flagging here. I'd love to give everybody a chance to speak before we get cut off, because this thing will cut us off. I'm trying to open up Didi. Yeah. Achudnanda. Dada, sorry. Last comment,
Can you hear
Dada.
okay?
Yep, we can hear you well.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I missed quite a few bits and pieces of it due to some practical problems I was having, so I may have missed a part that answers my question very well, but I never understood what you meant by relational consciousness, and I wonder if you could could simply say what is relating to what.
Okay, thank you. And it's a good way to end this presentation, actually. Relational consciousness is the awareness that we are not isolated or separate, but that we are part of systems, local systems, family systems, social systems, organic systems, various biophysical systems, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, the lithosphere, all these systems, and of course ultimately the cosmos. The relational consciousness that seems, from my research, to be emerging is a return to a sense is a return to a sense of connection or relationship that will determine how we decision make into the future, how will we educate into the future in ways that will not just further the limited or local interest of a specific group or even a specific species, but will be much more planet cosmic centered. I think I'll need to end it there. Really, thank you so much for all of you for making the effort to join us. This webinar will be available quite soon for you to download and listen to again. I am very happy to receive direct emails from you if you want clarification or want to consider other questions that have arisen. And finally, it needs to be said that this is obviously an area that we could devote many webinars to, and I think we can look forward to more discussions and conversations like this. Thank you very much all for your time, and have, well, I was going to say a great evening. It's a great evening for me, but wherever you are, whenever you are, take care. Thank you, and goodbye.